The train slowed as it approached the familiar station, its brakes hissing against the summer heat that hung heavy over the small town I'd left behind 6 years ago. Through the smudged window, I watched the countryside roll past, endless fields of corn and wheat, weathered barns that leaned against time, and the kind of sky that stretched so wide it made you feel both infinite and impossibly small. I pressed my forehead to the glass, feeling the vibration travel through my bones, and wondered why coming home always felt like stepping backward through time. My phone buzzed against my thigh. Another email from the firm, another crisis that apparently couldn't wait until I returned to the city. But I let it buzz. For the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't going to answer. I was here for Emma's wedding, here to help my little sister marry a man I barely knew, and for once the corporate world would have to spin without me. The station hadn't changed. Same peeling paint on the platform benches, same hand-painted sign that read "Welcome to Millbrook" in fading letters. Emma stood near the edge of the platform, her blonde hair catching the late afternoon sun, waving with the kind of enthusiasm that made me remember why I'd missed her so much. She looked radiant in that way people do when they're truly happy, a glow that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than skin. "David!" She launched herself into my arms before I'd even fully stepped off the train, nearly knocking me backward with the force of her hug. "I can't believe you're actually here. I was starting to think you'd send another excuse." I held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, something floral and sweet that reminded me of home. "I promised I'd be here, didn't I?" "You promise a lot of things from that glass tower of yours," she said, pulling back to study my face with those sharp green eyes we'd inherited from our mother. "You look tired and pale. When's the last time you saw actual sunlight?" "I see sunlight through my office window every day. That doesn't count." She linked her arm through mine as we walked toward the parking area. "Come on. I want you to meet Michael properly. He's been nervous about this all week." Michael, the groom, the man who was going to take my sister away from this place and build a life with her somewhere new. I'd met him exactly twice, once at Christmas 2 years ago when Emma first brought him home, and once last spring at our cousin's birthday party. Both times he'd been polite but quiet, the kind of man who seemed to fade into the background of conversations, watching and listening rather than participating. Emma talked about him constantly, but somehow I still felt like I didn't know him at all. "He's at the house helping Dad with something in the garage," Emma continued as we approached her car, the same beat-up Honda she'd been driving since high school. "Fair warning, Mom's been in full wedding planning mode for 3 weeks straight. She's got lists for everything, including a list of her lists. You're going to be put to work the second you walk through that door." The drive through town was a tour of preserved memories. The hardware store where I'd bought my first pocket knife, the diner where Emma and I used to split chocolate milkshakes, the library where I'd spent countless hours reading about places far away from Millbrook. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, as if the city had stretched my perspective and I could no longer see this place through the eyes of the boy who'd grown up here. "You know," Emma said as we turned onto the familiar tree-lined street that led to our childhood home, "I used to think you hated it here." "I never hated it." "Really?" "Because you couldn't wait to leave. Couldn't wait to get to college, then to your job, then to that apartment that costs more per month than most people here make in 3. I watched the houses drift by, modest homes with wide porches and gardens where neighbors actually knew each other's names. I didn't hate it, I just needed something different. And now? Now what? Do you still need something different?" Before I could answer, we were pulling into the driveway of the house where I'd spent the first 18 years of my life. It looked exactly the same. White clapboard siding, blue shutters, the wraparound porch where our mother kept her collection of wind chimes. The oak tree in the front yard had grown taller, its branches now reaching the second-story windows, but everything else was frozen in time. Mom emerged from the front door before we'd even gotten out of the car, wiping her hands on a dish towel and beaming with the kind of joy that made my chest tight. "There's my boy," she called, hurrying down the porch steps. "Look at you, all grown up and important." The hug she gave me smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, like every childhood comfort I'd forgotten I missed. I'm not that important, Mom. You're important to me, she said, holding me at arm's length to examine my face the same way Emma had. Though you do look thin. Are you eating enough? And what's this? She reached up to touch the corner of my eye. Crow's feet. At 26. That job of yours is aging you, sweetheart. It's just the train ride. I'm fine. Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. She stepped back, clasping her hands together. Emma, take him inside and get him settled. Michael should be finished in the garage soon, and then we can all have dinner together. I made that roast you used to love, David. The house wrapped around me like a familiar embrace. Same hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, same family photos lining the hallway, same smell of lemon furniture polish and whatever candle Mom had burning in the kitchen. My room was exactly as I'd left it. Twin bed with the blue plaid comforter, desk where I'd written my college application essays, bookshelf packed with novels I'd read until the spines cracked. I set my suitcase on the bed and walked to the window that overlooked the backyard. The garden was in full summer bloom, Mom's pride and joy with rows of tomatoes and peppers, beds of flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. The wooden swing Dad had built when Emma and I were kids still hung from the old maple tree, moving gently in the evening breeze. And there, emerging from the garage with my father, was Michael. He was taller than I remembered, probably 6'2" to my 5'10", with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it and broad shoulders that strained against a faded blue t-shirt. Even from this distance, there was something about the way he moved, deliberate and careful, like he was always thinking 2 steps ahead. He was listening intently to whatever Dad was saying, nodding occasionally, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his jeans. As if sensing my attention, he looked up toward my window. Our eyes met across the yard, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, neither of us looked away. There was something in his expression I couldn't read, recognition maybe, or curiosity, or something else entirely. Then Dad clapped him on the shoulder, breaking the moment, and they both headed toward the house. David, Emma's voice called from downstairs. Come meet your future brother-in-law properly. I took a breath, straightened my shirt, and headed downstairs. Michael was standing in the kitchen doorway when I reached the bottom of the stairs, and up close the impact of him was even stronger. He had the kind of face that belonged in a photograph. Strong jawline, dark eyes that seemed to see everything, skin that spoke of time spent outdoors. But it was the way he stood that caught my attention. Alert but relaxed, like he was comfortable taking up space but didn't need to demand it. Michael, this is my brother David, Emma said, practically bouncing with excitement. David, this is Michael. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Good to see you again, he said, and his voice was exactly as I remembered, low and steady, with just a hint of the local accent that most people here carried. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his palm slightly rough with calluses. You too, I managed, trying to ignore the way his touch seemed to linger a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Emma tells me you've been helping with wedding preparations. Trying to, he said with a small smile that transformed his entire face. Though I think I'm better at the physical labor than the decorating decisions. He's being modest, Emma interjected. He's the one who figured out how to hang all those string lights in the backyard without electrocuting himself, and he built the arch we're getting married under. Emma wanted something specific, Michael said, and there was genuine affection in his voice when he looked at her. Store-bought didn't seem right. I watched them together, the way Emma's face lit up when he spoke, the way his expression softened when he looked at her. They fit together in that easy way couples do when they've found their rhythm. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite name, that made me feel like I was watching them from behind glass. How long are you here for? Michael asked, turning his attention back to me. 2 weeks, until after the wedding. That's perfect, Mom said, bustling into the kitchen with a pot roast that smelled like heaven. I've got a list of things that need doing, and Michael can't handle everything himself. You boys can work together. Something flickered across Michael's face, so quickly I might have imagined it. I'd appreciate the help, he said. Over dinner, I learned more about Michael than I had in our previous two encounters combined. He'd grown up here in Millbrook, just a few streets over from our house, but he was a year older and had traveled in different circles. He'd gone to state school for engineering, worked for a construction company in the city for a few years, then came back home to take over his uncle's contracting business when the man retired. He's being modest again, Emma said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. He's turned that little contracting business into the most successful construction company in 3 counties. Everyone wants Michael Lawson to build their house. It's just good timing, Michael said, but I could see the pride in his eyes. People are moving out of the cities, looking for somewhere quieter. I just happened to be here when they needed someone to build it for them. Is that why you came back? I asked. For the business opportunity? He was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Partly, but mostly because this is home. Sometimes you don't realize what you have until you leave it behind. His eyes met mine across the table when he said it, and I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition of something I'd been trying not to think about since I'd stepped off the train. After dinner, we all migrated to the front porch, settling into the wicker furniture that had been there since I was a child. Mom brought out glasses of sweet tea, and Dad fired up his pipe, filling the evening air with a familiar scent of cherry tobacco. Emma curled up in the porch swing with Michael, her head on his shoulder, and I found myself in the rocking chair I'd claimed as my own when I was 12. The conversation drifted over wedding details, family gossip, and memories of summers past. Michael mostly listened, occasionally adding a comment or answering a direct question, but I found myself watching him more than participating in the conversation. There was something magnetic about his stillness, the way he seemed completely present in each moment without feeling the need to fill every silence. When Emma started yawning, Mom declared it was time for everyone to get some rest. Tomorrow we start the real work, she announced. The tent rental people are coming at 8, and we need to figure out the seating arrangements, and David, I need you to go pick up the flowers with Michael. Of course, I said, though something in my stomach tightened at the thought of spending time alone with him. As everyone was saying their goodnights, Michael lingered on the porch. It was good to see you again, he said quietly. Really? You too. He hesitated as if he wanted to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. See you tomorrow morning. I watched him walk to his truck, an old Ford with paint that had faded to the color of dust, and drive away into the darkness. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. That night, I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening to me. It had been less than 12 hours since I'd arrived, and already I felt off balance in a way that had nothing to do with being back home. There was something about Michael, something in the way he looked at me or the way I found myself looking at him, that made me feel like I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. He was going to marry my sister in 2 weeks. He was a good man who clearly loved her, and she was radiant with happiness. I had no right to be lying here thinking about the way his voice sounded when he said my name, or the brief moment when our hands had touched during his introduction. I rolled over and buried my face in the pillow that still smelled faintly of the fabric softener Mom had used for as long as I could remember. I was here for Emma's wedding, nothing more, nothing less. Whatever strange tension I was imagining would fade once I settled back into the rhythm of this place. But even as I told myself this, I knew it wasn't true. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising another scorching day. I woke to the sound of voices in the backyard and the rhythmic thud of something heavy being moved around. When I looked out my window, I saw Michael and Dad setting up long tables under the shade of the maple tree, both of them already sweating through their shirts despite the early hour. I dressed quickly in jeans and a t-shirt, grateful I'd had the foresight to pack casual clothes, and headed downstairs to find Mom and Emma in the kitchen, surrounded by what appeared to be every wedding magazine ever published. There you are, Mom said without looking up from a page of flower arrangements. Michael's been here since 7 helping your father. The least you can do is take him some coffee. She thrust a steaming mug into my hands before I could protest, and I found myself walking across the dewy grass toward the 2 men who were now debating the best placement for a series of white garden chairs. Coffee delivery, I announced, holding out the mug to Michael. You're a lifesaver, Gisir, he said, accepting it with a grateful smile. His fingers brushed mine as he took the mug, and I felt that same jolt of electricity I'd experienced the night before. I've been up since 5 trying to get ahead of this heat. 5? I checked my watch. It was barely 8:30. Do you always start work that early? When I have a choice between working in 70-degree weather or 90-degree weather, yeah. He took a long sip of coffee and closed his eyes briefly as if savoring it. Your mom makes the best coffee in 3 counties. She'd be flattered to hear you say that. I tell her every chance I get. Dad wandered off to examine something on the other side of the yard, leaving Michael and me alone with the chairs. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, creating neat rows that would eventually hold Emma's wedding guests. The physical labor felt good after months of sitting behind a desk, and I found myself settling into the rhythm of lift, carry, position, adjust. So, Michael said as we maneuvered a particularly stubborn chair into place, Emma tells me you work in marketing. Corporate communications, technically, but yeah, marketing adjacent. What's that like, the corporate world? I paused, considering how to answer. Busy, competitive, sometimes rewarding, often exhausting. Do you like it? Most days. It was an honest answer, though not a complete one. What about you? Do you like what you do? I love it, he said without hesitation. There's something satisfying about building something from nothing, you know? Starting with raw materials and ending up with a place where people will make memories. There was passion in his voice that I recognized, the same tone I used to have when I talked about writing, back before I'd gotten caught up in the machinery of corporate advancement. That sounds fulfilling. It is. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Though I imagine there are things about your job that are fulfilling too. Emma's always talking about how successful you are, how proud she is of what you've accomplished. Emma thinks everyone she loves is more impressive than they actually are. Maybe. Or maybe you don't give yourself enough credit. Before I could respond to that, Mom's voice rang out across the yard. David, Michael, the flower people are here. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. We loaded cases of flowers into Michael's truck, drove to 3 different suppliers to pick up linens and decorations, and returned home to find that the tent rental company had transformed the backyard into something that looked almost magical. White fabric draped between poles, strings of lights waiting to be illuminated, tables and chairs arranged with mathematical precision. Oh my God, Emma breathed, emerging from the house to survey the transformation. It's perfect. It's exactly what I imagined. Michael stood beside her, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and I could see the satisfaction in his expression. This was his handiwork as much as anyone's, his planning and labor that had turned Emma's vision into reality. The arch still needs flowers, Mom announced, consulting one of her many lists. And we need to figure out the centerpieces. David, you're good with arranging things, aren't you? I was, actually, though I wasn't sure how she'd retain that information from my teenage years. I can help. Perfect. You and Michael can work on the flowers while Emma and I finalize the menu with the caterers. And just like that, Michael and I found ourselves alone in the garage, surrounded by buckets of flowers and spools of ribbon, trying to create something beautiful out of organized chaos. I have to admit, Michael said, examining a bundle of white roses, I'm better at building the arch than decorating it. It's not that different from construction, I said, selecting a few stems of baby's breath. You're just building with flowers instead of wood. We worked side by side, our hands occasionally brushing as we reached for the same materials. Each touch seemed to carry more weight than it should, lingering in my awareness long after our fingers had moved apart. Michael had good hands, strong and sure, with long fingers that handled the delicate flowers with surprising gentleness. Do you ever wonder if all this is really what you want? I asked suddenly, surprising myself with the question. Michael paused, a stem of ivy halfway to the arch. What do you mean? This, the wedding, the big production, all the fuss. Sometimes I wonder if people get so caught up in the event that they forget about the actual marriage. He was quiet for a long moment, considering. Sometimes, he said finally, but I think I stopped asking myself that a long time ago. There was something in his voice, a note of resignation or maybe acceptance, that made me look at him more closely. What do you mean? I mean, sometimes you reach a point where you stop questioning the path you're on and just focus on walking it well. That sounds like settling. Maybe it is. He attached the ivy to the arch with careful precision. But settling isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's just choosing certainty over possibility. I wanted to ask him what possibilities he'd given up, but something in his expression warned me off. Instead, I handed him another stem of ivy and tried to ignore the way my pulse quickened when his fingers closed over mine. We worked in silence after that, the air between us thick with unspoken questions. By the time we finished, the arch was transformed, elegant and romantic, exactly the kind of backdrop Emma had dreamed of for her wedding photos. "She's going to love it," I said, stepping back to admire our work. "I hope so." Michael wiped his hands on a towel, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Thank you for helping with all this. I know you probably have better things to do with your vacation time." "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," I said, and realized I meant it. The rest of that first week fell into a pattern. Mornings spent working alongside Michael, setting up decorations, moving furniture, handling the 1,000 small tasks that go into planning a wedding. Afternoons with the whole family, running errands, or hosting the various relatives who were arriving early to help with preparations. Evenings on the front porch, talking and laughing until the fireflies came out and Mom declared it was time for bed. But it was the mornings I looked forward to, those quiet hours when it was just Michael and me, working with our hands and talking about everything and nothing. I learned that he'd wanted to be an architect before he'd settled on engineering, that he'd lived in Chicago for 3 years and missed the way you could disappear into a crowd of strangers, that he read voraciously. Everything from literary fiction to scientific journals to biographies of people he'd never heard of until he saw their books in the library. "What about you?" he asked one morning as we arranged chairs for the ceremony. "What did you want to be when you were a kid?" "A writer," I said without thinking, then felt embarrassed by the admission. I was going to write the great American novel and live in a cabin somewhere, surviving on nothing but coffee and artistic integrity. What happened to that dream? Reality, I guess. Turns out artistic integrity doesn't pay student loans. Do you still write? I shook my head. Not really. Sometimes I start something, but I never finish it. It's like I've forgotten how to write for myself instead of for a client. Maybe you just need the right inspiration. The way he said it, quietly, without looking at me, made something flutter in my chest. I found myself watching him more carefully after that, noticing the way he moved through the world with a kind of thoughtful deliberation that was completely different from the frantic energy of my city life. There were moments when I caught him watching me too. Across the backyard while we strung lights between trees, his gaze lingering on my face until I looked up and our eyes met. Standing in the kitchen while I made coffee, his attention focused on my hands as I measured grounds and filled the pot. Once, memorably, from the garden where he was helping Mom plant extra flowers, staring up at my bedroom window with an expression I couldn't decipher. Each time he didn't look away immediately when our eyes met. Instead, there would be a moment, just a heartbeat, where something passed between us, something that made my breath catch and my pulse quicken. Then one of us would remember where we were, what we were supposed to be doing, and the moment would break. But the tension was building. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken when we were alone together, in the careful distance we maintained even when we were working side by side, in the increasingly frequent silences that felt loaded with things neither of us was willing to say. He was going to marry my sister. I reminded myself of this fact every morning when I woke up and every night before I fell asleep. Emma loved him and he loved her. I could see it in the way he looked at her, the way he listened when she talked, the way he remembered every small detail she mentioned. They were good together, compatible in all the ways that mattered. But there was something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. In the quiet moments when it was just Michael and me, when we were focused on some task and the rest of the world fell away, there was a connection that felt deeper than friendship, more charged than simple attraction. It was dangerous territory and I knew it, but knowing something is dangerous and being able to stay away from it are two entirely different things. The breaking point came on Thursday evening, exactly 1 week before the wedding. We'd spent the day making final adjustments to the ceremony space, and everyone was exhausted. Mom and Dad had gone to bed early, claiming they needed their rest for the rehearsal dinner preparations that would begin the next morning. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, curled up with her head on Michael's shoulder while he read a book. I'd been trying to read too, but I kept getting distracted by the sight of them together. Emma's blonde hair spilling across Michael's chest, his free hand resting gently on her arm. They looked peaceful, domestic, like a preview of the life they'd build together after the wedding. I should get her to bed, Michael said quietly, noticing that I was watching them. Let me, I said, standing up. She's lighter than she looks, but she gets cranky if you wake her up wrong. He smiled at that. I'm still learning all her quirks. I scooped Emma up as carefully as I could, and she mumbled something incoherent but didn't wake up. She felt tiny in my arms, my little sister who had somehow grown up and fallen in love while I wasn't paying attention. I carried her upstairs to her room, tucked her under the covers, and kissed her forehead the way I used to when we were kids. When I came back downstairs, Michael was still sitting on the couch, but his book was closed and he was staring out the window at something I couldn't see. She's out for the night, I reported. Good, she's been running herself ragged with all these preparations. I should have said good night then. Should have headed upstairs to my own room and left him to find his own way out. Instead, I found myself settling into the chair across from him. Can I ask you something? I said. Sure. Are you nervous? About the wedding, I mean. He considered the question, running his hand through his hair in a gesture I'd begun to recognize as a sign that he was thinking carefully about his response. Yes and no, he said finally. That's not really an answer. It's an honest one. He looked at me directly. I'm not nervous about marrying Emma. She's wonderful and I know we'll be happy together. But the whole production, all the people watching, making promises in front of everyone, he shrugged. That part makes me nervous. You don't strike me as someone who gets nervous about much. You'd be surprised. There was something in his voice that made me lean forward. What else makes you nervous? Lately, he met my eyes. You. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. I felt my heart skip, then start beating double time. Me? Yeah. He didn't look away. You make me nervous, David. I don't understand. Don't you? And the terrible thing was I did understand. I understood exactly what he meant because he made me nervous too. Made me feel off balance and hyper-aware and like I was constantly on the verge of saying something I shouldn't say. Michael, I know, he said quickly. I know this is crazy. I know you're Emma's brother and I'm supposed to marry her in a week and this is the last thing either of us should be talking about. Then why are we talking about it? Because I can't stop thinking about it. About you. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. Ever since you got here, I can't stop thinking about you. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at him and try to process what he'd just said. I noticed you watching me, I said finally. I noticed you watching me too. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the admission settling between us. In the distance, I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, marking time until Emma's wedding, until the moment when whatever was happening between Michael and me would become impossible rather than just inadvisable. What are we doing? I asked. I don't know. He ran his hands through his hair again. I've never felt anything like this before. Like what? Like I'm standing at the edge of a cliff and the only thing I want to do is jump. I knew exactly what he meant. The pull I felt toward him was magnetic, inexorable, like gravity had shifted and he'd become the center of everything. You're going to marry my sister, I said, as much to remind myself as to remind him. I know. She loves you. I know that too. And you love her. He was quiet for a long time. Yes, he said gently. But not the way I should. Not the way she deserves. The confession hit me like a physical blow. Michael, I tried, he said, and there was pain in his voice. I really tried to love her the way she loves me. She's amazing, kind and funny and beautiful and everything any man should want. But there's something missing, something I've been telling myself would come with time. And now? Now I think I know what was missing. He looked at me when he said it, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. This is insane, I whispered. Yeah, we can't do this. I know. But neither of us moved. Neither of us stood up and walked away and pretended this conversation had never happened. Instead, we sat there looking at each other, the air between us crackling with possibility and impossibility in equal measure. I should go, Michael said eventually. You should. But he didn't get up, and I didn't tell him to leave. David, he said, and my name in his voice sounded like a question and an answer and a prayer all at once. Yeah? I don't know what this is, but I don't want to stop feeling it. Before I could respond, before I could think of all the reasons why this was the worst possible thing that could happen, he stood up and walked out of the room. A moment later, I heard the front door close quietly behind him. I sat in the empty living room for a long time after that, staring at the spot where he'd been sitting and trying to understand what had just happened. The smart thing would be to pretend this conversation had never occurred, to treat Michael with polite distance for the remaining week until the wedding, to be the supportive brother Emma needed me to be. But as I finally headed upstairs to bed, I knew I wasn't going to do the smart thing. Because Michael was right. I didn't want to stop feeling it either. And that realization terrified me more than anything I'd ever experienced in my carefully controlled, predictable city life. Tomorrow was the rehearsal dinner. In 7 days, Emma would walk down the aisle in her white dress, and Michael would promise to love and cherish her for the rest of their lives. But tonight, for the first time since I'd stepped off that train, I wasn't thinking about my sister's happiness. I was thinking about the way Michael had said my name, and the way it had sounded like the beginning of something that could destroy everything we both cared about. The terrible thing was, I wasn't sure I cared. Yeah,